The dead tank moved. At 2:17 in the morning on July 13, 1943, somewhere south of the Kursk salient, a Soviet recovery crew was crawling toward a T-34 that should not have mattered anymore. The tank sat low in the mud, its left track broken, its hull scarred by shell splinters, its turret frozen slightly off-center like a head turned toward the last thing it had seen. The battle had moved for the moment, but not far. German artillery still breathed across the fields in slow, irregular bursts. Every few minutes the darkness turned white, and the wrecks appeared for a second. Black shapes, torn guns, open hatches, metal ribs sticking out of the ground. A man with grease under his fingernails lay flat beside the damaged tank and tried to find the towing eye by touch. His name might never have appeared in a report. Men like him often disappeared behind phrases such as maintenance personnel, recovery crew, repair detachment. For the purposes of this story, we will call him Sergeant Ivan Morozov, not because one man alone did this work, but because thousands of men like him did. Mechanics, drivers, welders, tank crews, tractor operators. Men who knew that a tank could look dead and still have something left to give. Morozov's gloves scraped against cold steel. The metal was wet, not from rain alone. Mud, oil, soot, water, and something darker had mixed along the lower hull. He did not look inside the tank longer than he had to. In recovery work, there were things a man learned to notice and things he learned to leave for later. Behind him, another engine coughed in the dark. A recovery vehicle, maybe a tank pressed into towing work, maybe a tractor, maybe another T-34 with its crew holding their breath, waited with its engine idling low. Too much noise could draw attention. Too little power and the wreck would not move. The cable came next. It made a small sound, almost insulting in a place where artillery had been shaking the earth all day. A hook against armor. A chain dragged through mud. Someone whispered. Someone cursed under his breath. A flare rose far off to the west, and every man froze until the light fell. German commanders, studying the field after the fighting, had every reason to think this tank was finished. They had seen Soviet armor burn. They had seen turrets blown loose and tracks peeled away. They had seen whole attacks collapse into smoke and wreckage. To them, a stopped tank was a number, a mark on a report, a proof that firepower had done its work. But on that field, in the dark, the war had not accepted the German definition. A tank with a broken track was not the same as a tank destroyed beyond repair. A tank with a damaged clutch, a shattered road wheel, a torn fuel line, or jammed turret ring was not always lost. If men could reach it before dawn, if they could pull it out before German guns found them, if spare parts could be found, if the mechanics still had strength in their hands, the wreck might move again. That was the part many officers on both sides failed to see clearly. The battle did not end when the guns went quiet. Another battle began in the dark, fought with cables instead of cannon, with wrenches instead of rifles, with men lying under steel while the front line shifted around them. The cable tightened. For a moment, nothing happened. The wreck resisted. Mud held it down. The broken track dug into the earth like an anchor. The towing vehicle strained, engine note rising, then falling. Somewhere to the right, a shell landed close enough for clods of dirt to slap against the hull. Morozov kept one hand on the cable and one eye on the sky. If the hook slipped, it could tear a man in half. If the Germans spotted the movement, the recovery crew would have no trench, no armor, no clean line of escape. If dawn came too early, the dead tank would remain where it was, and German gunners would finish what they had started. Then the hull shifted, only a few inches. But in that small movement was the truth German commanders had not yet understood. The tank was not alive. Not yet. But it was no longer simply dead. And by morning, somewhere behind the Soviet line, mechanics would be waiting. They would not ask whether the Germans had counted the vehicle as destroyed. They would ask what was broken. They would ask what could be removed from another wreck. They would ask whether the engine could still turn, whether the gearbox was gone, whether the turret could be freed, whether the track links could be replaced. The Germans believed the sight of Soviet wrecks meant Soviet armored strength was being bled away in a simple, visible way. What really happened was stranger. Some wrecks did not stay wrecks. And to understand why that mattered, we have to look at the battlefield through German eyes first. Through binoculars, through after-action reports, through the confidence that came from seeing Soviet tanks burn. Because before the recovery crews could change the meaning of a wreck, the enemy had to believe that a wreck meant victory. Wrecks meant victory. By the summer of 1943, German officers had learned to read a battlefield by its remains. A burned-out tank near a ridge. A broken column in a wheat field. A turret thrown sideways by internal explosion. Tracks lying loose in the mud like torn belts. These were not only sights. They were evidence. For a commander under pressure, evidence mattered. Reports needed numbers. Headquarters needed proof. Divisions needed to show that their anti-tank guns, assault guns, Tigers, Panthers, mines, and aircraft were still stopping the Soviet tide. A wreck was simple. It was visible, could be pointed to, could be counted. And on the Eastern Front, there were days when the field seemed to offer Germany exactly that kind of proof. Soviet attacks could be costly beyond imagination. Tank brigades moved through artillery fire, mine belts, anti-tank screens, and air attack. Vehicles bogged down. Engines overheated. Crews became disoriented in smoke and dust. Some tanks burned. Some were hit from the flank. Some drove into ravines, shell holes, or soft ground. Some were abandoned when the crew thought one more minute inside the machine would kill them. From a German observation post, all of it could look like collapse. An officer lifting binoculars after a Soviet attack might see 10, 20, 30 tanks halted in front of his sector. Some smoking, some silent, some with hatches open, some with no movement around them at all. The conclusion was tempting. They had come. They had been stopped. They had been destroyed. It was not always arrogance. Sometimes the belief was built from experience. German gunners knew what their weapons could do. A high-velocity anti-tank round striking the right place could turn a tank into a furnace. A mine could tear away a track and leave a vehicle helpless in open ground. A shell through the fighting compartment could kill or wound the crew before the tank had even stopped rolling. To men facing Soviet armor, a knocked-out tank was not an abstraction. It was survival. One less gun firing back. One less engine coming forward. One less steel shape moving through smoke. So when German commanders counted wrecks, they were not inventing a fantasy from nothing. They were building a belief from what the battlefield showed them. But battlefields lie by omission. A tank can stop for many reasons. A thrown track can immobilize it without destroying the hull. A damaged road will trap it in place. A broken clutch can make it useless for the moment but reparable later. A jammed turret can turn a combat vehicle into a temporary burden, not permanent scrap. A cracked radiator, a damaged fuel line, shattered optics, a stuck gear, a wounded driver, a dead commander. Each could remove a tank from a fight without ending its mechanical life. The German report might use a word that sounded final. Destroyed. The Soviet mechanic might use a different word. Recoverable. Between those two words stood a whole hidden war. The difference mattered because industrial warfare was not only about how many tanks an army could build. It was also about how many it could keep in circulation after the first blow. A tank force that loses vehicles permanently bleeds one way. A tank force that recovers damaged machines bleeds differently. It still suffers. It still loses crews, time, fuel, tools, and strength. But the arithmetic changes. German commanders understood repair, of course. The Wehrmacht had its own maintenance systems and recovery needs. German armored forces knew painfully well that a tank broken down in the wrong place could be as useless as one hit by enemy fire. But by 1943, the Eastern Front was stretching every assumption. Distances were enormous. Roads were poor. Fuel was limited. Spare parts were never where they were needed in sufficient quantity. Recovery vehicles themselves could break down or be lost. What the Germans often underestimated was not the concept of repair. It was the Soviet willingness to make recovery part of the battle itself. To drag tanks out while the ground was still dangerous. To push repair points close to the front. To cannibalize one shattered machine so two others could move. To treat a battlefield full of wrecks not only as a graveyard, but as a reservoir. That idea was hard to see from a distance. A German staff officer looking at aerial photographs might mark a field of destroyed Soviet tanks and believe he was looking at the end of a formation strength. But he could not see what happened after dark. He could not hear the tractor engines beginning low behind the line. He could not see men moving with cables, crowbars, spare track links, and acetylene equipment. He could not see a damaged machine being pulled back 1 kilometer, then 5, then 10. He could not see the wreck becoming a problem for mechanics instead of a victory for gunners. And that was the hidden error. The German count treated the battlefield as if destruction were a single event. Hit, burn, stop, count. The Soviet system, under brutal pressure, treated destruction as a process that might still be interrupted. Hit, stop, recover, strip, repair, return, or fail. There was always failure. Many tanks could not be saved. Some burned too thoroughly. Some were under enemy observation. Some were blown apart. Some had no crew left. Some were lost in ground that could not be reached. Some were recovered only to become donors, their engines, gearboxes, and road wheels taken away so other vehicles could fight. But that did not make recovery useless. It made recovery selective, ruthless, practical. German commanders believed wrecks meant victory because wrecks were what they could see. What they could not see was the Soviet repair line forming behind the smoke. And in that hidden line, far from the drama of tanks charging across open fields, men with blackened hands were beginning to change the meaning of armored warfare. Not with slogans, with cables, with parts, with nights without sleep, and with one question asked over and over beside every damaged hull. Can this one fight again? The hidden war behind the front. The front line on a map looked like a line. In reality, it was a zone of broken things. Behind the tanks that attacked, behind the infantry that dug in, behind the artillery that fired until the gun barrels were hot, there was another landscape. Less dramatic from a distance, but just as necessary. It was made of repair points, fuel dumps, ammunition stacks, spare track links, field kitchens, medical stations, and exhausted men trying to make damaged machines useful again before the next order arrived. This was where Soviet tank recovery lived. Not in one place. Not in one clean, organized workshop with painted floors and proper lighting. It lived in ravines, orchards, farmyards, roadside clearings, and muddy collection points marked only by the smell of oil and the shape of wounded armor under camouflage nets. A disabled tank did not simply return to battle because someone wanted it to. It had to be found, reached, assessed, pulled back, sorted, repaired or stripped, refueled, rearmed, crewed, sent forward again. Every step could fail. The first problem was distance. A tank hit too far forward might sit under German guns. A tank bogged down in open ground might be visible to artillery observers. A vehicle abandoned in a minefield might be recoverable in theory and unreachable in practice. The field itself became part of the enemy. The second problem was classification. Mechanics had to decide quickly what kind of damage they were facing. Minor repair, medium repair, major repair, beyond field repair, useful only for parts. Dangerous to touch because ammunition might still cook off inside. Worth towing. Not worth dying for. Those decisions were not made in calm conditions. They were made while men were hungry, sleepless, and half-deaf from shellfire. They were made beside tanks still warm from battle. Sometimes with wounded men nearby. Sometimes with dead crewmen still inside. Sometimes while the next attack was already being planned. At Kursk, Soviet repair and recovery work became more than background labor. It became a measure of whether armored formations could keep fighting after days of punishing losses. Reports and later accounts suggest that damaged vehicles were collected, repaired, stripped for parts, or pushed into repair streams depending on the severity of damage and the available resources. Some urgent repair points operated close enough to the front that the sound of battle would not have faded into memory. It would still have been present, a low pressure in the air. That proximity mattered. A factory hundreds of miles away could build strength for the future. A repair detachment near the front could return strength to tomorrow morning. But the closer the repair system moved to the battle, the more fragile it became. A repair point too close could be shelled. A road used for evacuation could be cut. A tractor needed for towing could be destroyed. A shortage of engines or gearboxes could immobilize machines that otherwise might have been saved. A missing clutch could matter as much as an enemy gun. This was the strange truth of mechanized war. Great battles were decided not only by tanks that advanced, but by parts that arrived. Not only by commanders who ordered attacks, but by mechanics who could tell whether an engine had one more day left in it. Not only by production totals in distant factories, but by whether a crew could find a road wheel in the mud before dawn. The Soviet system was often rough. It was not always efficient. It was not free from confusion, shortages, bad communication, or brutal pressure from above. The Red Army paid terrible prices, and its repair system could be overwhelmed by the scale of loss. But it had one harsh advantage. It understood that a battlefield was not clean. A tank did not have to return beautiful. It did not have to return as it had left the factory. It only had to move, fire, communicate enough, and survive long enough to matter in the next fight. A patched tank was still a tank. A mismatched road wheel did not bother the enemy if the gun still fired. A turret scar did not appear in German calculations if the vehicle came back through the smoke the next day. And so the hidden war continued. Men stripped usable engines from machines too badly damaged to save. They removed gearboxes. They took steering clutches, wheels, track links, radios, gun sights, anything that could keep another hull moving. There was a quiet cruelty in it. One tank died so another could return. One crew's machine became another crew's chance. The men doing this work lived between two worlds. To the combat troops, they were rear area men until a tank needed saving. To headquarters, they were support personnel until numbers on a strength report fell too low. To the enemy, they were almost invisible until yesterday's wreck returned with mud still on its armor. That invisibility was part of their burden. A tank attack could be photographed. A breakthrough could be mapped. A destroyed enemy gun could be reported with pride. But the act of pulling a damaged vehicle out of mud at night left fewer clean images behind. It was too slow, too dirty, too technical, too close to labor to fit easily into heroic memory. Yet without that labor, armored warfare became a one-way road toward exhaustion. Every army learned this in some form. Machines made armies faster, stronger, and more powerful. But machines also multiplied dependence. Fuel, oil, parts, drivers, tools, roads, cranes, cables, repair manuals. Men who knew what a broken machine sounded like before it died. The German belief was that Soviet tank losses could be measured in visible wrecks. The battlefield reality was that some of those wrecks had already entered another system. Not the system of battle reports, but the system of recovery. And that system depended on people who rarely appeared in the center of the story. The men nobody counted. The men nobody counted. A mechanic knows a tank differently from a commander. A commander sees weight, speed, armor, gun caliber, fuel range, combat strength. He sees symbols on a map and columns in a report. He sees what the machine is supposed to do. A mechanic hears what it is no longer able to do. He hears the cough in the engine before the driver admits there is a problem. He notices the track tension by the way the vehicle turns. He smells fuel where fuel should not be. He can place his hand against the hull and feel, through steel, whether something inside is wrong. That kind of knowledge does not look dramatic. It does not announce itself. But at the front, it could decide whether a tank was lost or merely wounded. The Soviet men assigned to repair and recovery came from many places. Some had served in tank units long enough to know what German fire did to steel. Some had come from factories, from industrial cities where tanks were assembled in noise and smoke long before they appeared in combat. Some were specialists. Some were half-trained. Some learned because the war gave them no alternative. They did not all fit the image of the frontline hero. They were not always the first men into a village or the last men holding a trench. They carried tools more often than rifles. Their victories were quiet. A freed clutch, patched fuel line, a turret ring forced back into movement, a tank that started again after everyone expected silence. They worked in mud that swallowed boots, in snow that froze fingers around metal, in summer heat where oil, sweat, and cordite seemed to coat everything. They slept beside engines, under tarpaulins, on spare parts crates, or not at all. Their hands were often cut, burned, or swollen. They lived with the knowledge that a single missing part could make 10 hours of work useless. And still, they were asked to perform small miracles on machines designed to be repaired in places far safer than the Eastern Front. The T-34 had a reputation for ruggedness, but rugged did not mean immortal. Tracks broke, transmissions strained, engines failed, suspensions suffered. Combat damage tore through systems that no brochure or factory claim could protect. A tank might survive the shell that stopped it and then die slowly because no one could reach it in time. This was where the mechanic's judgment mattered. He had to decide what the tank was telling him. Commander might demand it back in service. A crew might beg for it to be saved because it was the only machine they knew. A repair officer might need parts from it for other vehicles. A towing crew might refuse to risk lives for a hull too far gone. And beneath all of that was fear. Not the clean fear of a man charging forward with everyone watching, but the private fear of crawling under a damaged tank and wondering whether artillery would start again. The fear of opening a hatch and seeing what the shell had done inside. The fear of working beside unexploded ammunition. The fear of being crushed when a cable snapped or a tank shifted in mud. No speech removed that fear. Most men simply worked with it nearby. There were probably moments of anger. A driver furious that his tank had been abandoned too close to German lines. A mechanic cursing an officer who demanded the impossible. A welder staring at a cracked plate and knowing the repair would not be pretty, only necessary. A young soldier holding a flashlight under a blanket so the light would not betray them, trying not to think about the flares. Their work had no clean beginning and no clean end. A recovered tank arrived, and the argument began. Save it? Strip it? Send it farther back? Patch it here? Wait for parts that might never arrive? Take the engine from that burned hull? Use a road wheel from that one? Can the gun still align? Is the radio gone? Is the crew alive? A factory worker might have once seen a tank as an object of production, steel plates, assembly lines, inspection marks. At the front, the same man saw it differently. He saw a wounded animal, a burden, a weapon, coffin, a chance. And the crews knew it too. Tank crews often formed attachments to their vehicles not because they imagined them alive, but because survival taught them intimacy. They knew every sound, every weak spot, every smell. They knew where to kick a stubborn hatch, where the engine complained on cold mornings, how the machine behaved in mud. To lose it was to lose a kind of protection. To recover it was sometimes to recover a piece of themselves. But recovery also had a darker side. A repaired tank might return with scars from the battle that killed part of its crew. A new driver might sit where another man had died the day before. A gunner might place his hand on a patched plate and understand that the machine had already been judged once by German fire. No one needed to say much. In war, silence often carries the heaviest information. The Germans believed Soviet tank forces were made of machines thrown forward and destroyed in waves. What they could not see clearly was the human network beneath those waves. The men who retrieved, repaired, stripped, rebuilt, and returned. The men who turned wreckage into a form of reserve. Not unlimited, not magical, not without cost, but real. And then came the idea that made even experienced soldiers hesitate. Do not wait until the battlefield is safe. Recover the tank while the enemy can still kill you. Recover it under fire. There is a difference between repairing a tank and recovering one. Repair begins when the machine is in your hands. Recovery begins when it is still in the battlefield's hands. That distinction mattered. A tank sitting behind the line with a broken track was a problem of tools, parts, and time. A tank lying forward of the line, under German observation, near mines or artillery, was something else. It was a test of nerve before it became a technical job. The idea could sound reckless. Why risk men for a disabled vehicle? Why send a tractor or another tank into ground that had already destroyed one machine? Why expose a recovery crew after dark, when confusion could kill as easily as enemy fire? Why not wait? The answer was simple and it was cruel. Waiting could mean losing the tank forever. A disabled tank was not neutral. It belonged to whoever could reach it, destroy it, strip it, or pull it back. If the Soviets recovered it, it might return. If the Germans reached it first, they might burn it, examine it, capture equipment, or deny its use. If artillery found it, the difference between reparable and destroyed could vanish in one shell burst. So the recovery men went forward. Sometimes they used tractors, but tractors had limits. Many were underpowered for heavy work in mud, and most offered little protection. A tractor towing a tank under shell fire could become an easy target, its driver exposed, its speed painfully slow. Sometimes Soviet units used tanks themselves as recovery vehicles because a tank at least had armor, power, and a chance to survive near the front. That solution brought its own risks. Use a fighting tank for towing, and you remove one more gun from the line. Send it into mud, and it may become stuck too. Attach the cable wrong, and both vehicles may be lost. Tow too quickly, and the cable may snap. Tow too slowly, and dawn catches you in open ground. There was no safe version. Imagine the moment before a recovery attempt. The damaged T-34 lies ahead, barely visible in darkness. The silhouette is broken, but not burned out. The crew has either escaped, been evacuated, or remains a question no one wants to ask yet. The ground between friendly lines and the tank has been crossed by shells, tracks, infantry, maybe mines. No one knows exactly what remains under the mud. The recovery crew waits for the artillery pattern to shift. A low voice gives the order. Move. The towing vehicle creeps forward. The driver cannot use full light. He steers by shadow, memory, shouted directions, and the instinct of a man trying not to drive into a crater. Behind him, men move bent low, carrying cables heavy enough to punish the shoulders. Every metallic sound seems too loud. When a flare rises, they stop. A man in the open at night under a flare feels suddenly naked. Even if the enemy does not fire, he feels seen. He feels his whole body become a target. Then darkness returns, and the men move again. At the wreck, the work becomes intimate. Someone checks the hull. Someone finds the towing point. Someone inspects the track just enough to know whether the tank can roll or must be dragged. If the wheels are locked, the job grows worse. If the mud is deep, worse again. If the turret is turned in a way that catches on the ground or debris, worse still. There are no heroic speeches. A man might only say, "Cable." Another might answer, "Wait." The hook goes on. The towing vehicle takes up slack. This is the moment when the whole operation becomes dangerous in a new way. A steel cable under strain is not a tool anymore. It is a line of stored violence. If it snaps, it can whip through the dark with enough force to kill. If the hook tears loose, anyone nearby may not even have time to flinch. The engine rises. The wreck does not move. The driver tries again. Mud sucks at the hull. The broken track digs deeper. Men push when pushing is useless because doing nothing feels worse. Somewhere in the distance, a machine gun fires into the night at something unseen. A shell lands far off. Another closer. Then the tank shifts. Half a meter, perhaps. Enough for hope. Not enough for safety. The crew keeps going. This is where the idea stopped being theory. Recovery under fire was not brave because it always worked. It was brave because it often did not. Men could die and recover nothing. A vehicle could be dragged back only to be judged beyond repair. A tractor could break down. A mine could end the attempt instantly. A German observer could catch movement and bring artillery down onto everyone. But when it worked, the meaning of the battlefield changed. The Germans had believed a tank stopped in front of their lines had been removed from the war. What really happened on some nights was that the tank was only temporarily in enemy view. And once it crossed back into Soviet hands, another question began. Not whether it had been hit, but whether enough of it remained to fight again. One tank before dawn. The first pull failed. The cable tightened until it hummed. The towing vehicle strained forward, and the damaged T-34 moved no more than the length of a man's hand. Then it settled back into the mud. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The driver kept the engine running low. The recovery men stood or crouched in the darkness. Their faces turned toward the wreck, breathing through smoke, cold air, and the sour smell of old fuel. Somewhere near the disabled tank, loose metal clicked in the wind. It is difficult to imagine how slow time becomes in a recovery operation under fire. In an attack, fear can be carried forward by movement. Men run because everyone is running. Tanks advance because the order is given and the engine is already roaring. But recovery is different. It is deliberate. It asks men to remain in danger and perform careful work. To inspect, attach, adjust, try again, listen, wait. Every minute feels stolen. At 2:31, the second attempt begins. The towing vehicle reverses slightly to change the angle. One man signals with his arm, barely visible. Another crouches beside the cable and then steps back fast, because no one wants to be close when the strain comes again. The engine rises. This time, the disabled tank lurches. Mud breaks around the road wheels with a wet tearing sound. The hull shifts sideways, then forward. A broken track drags under it like a chain caught beneath a door. The towing vehicle pulls harder, its own tracks biting into the ground. Then something stops. Maybe the broken track has folded under the wheel. Maybe the tank has caught on a crater lip. Maybe the mud is deeper than anyone thought. The engine note changes. The driver knows that sound. Every mechanic does. It is the sound of power becoming heat and strain. If he keeps pulling too long, he may damage the towing vehicle too. A hand slaps the hull. Stop. Men move in again. One crawls down near the track. His fingers find packed mud, twisted metal, a section of track link jammed under weight no human body can move. He calls for a bar. Someone brings it. The work becomes primitive. Lever, shove, curse, breathe, try again. A flare goes up. Everything freezes. In the white light, the field appears with cruel clarity. The wrecks are no longer shadows. The men are no longer hidden by darkness. The cable shines. The disabled tank sits exposed, its turret scar visible, its open hatch like a black mouth. No one fires. The flare sinks. A man exhales so hard it sounds almost like a laugh. But it is not laughter. 2:44, the third pull begins. This time they do not ask the tank to roll cleanly. They drag it. The sound is ugly. Metal scraping mud. Broken track clattering. The towing engine working too hard. The hull moving in short, reluctant surges. 10 meters. Stop. Another pull. 15 meters. Stop again. A German shell lands closer now. The blast punches the air. Dirt falls across the disabled tank. One man goes down, then rises before anyone can reach him. He has not been hit. He slipped. Or perhaps he was hit lightly and refuses to know it yet. The men keep moving. This is the part often missing from clean accounts of warfare. Machines do not simply move or fail to move. They resist. Ground resists. Weather resists. Tools slip. Men misjudge distances in the dark. Engines stall. Orders become whispers. Fear makes hands clumsy. And yet, sometimes the work continues because the alternative is leaving steel, effort, and perhaps tomorrow's survival in the mud. At 3:06, the wreck reaches ground less exposed to German observation. Not safe. Safer. That difference matters. The recovery crew does not celebrate. There is still too much to do. The tank must be moved farther back, perhaps to a collection point, perhaps to a temporary repair site. Someone checks whether the hull is leaking. Someone tries to determine if the engine can be started, though no one wants to run it loudly yet. Someone looks at the turret and shakes his head. Someone else says the track can be replaced. A quick judgment forms. Not dead. Damaged. Those words are not poetry. They are an order of priority. They tell the repairmen that the night's work may not have been wasted. But dawn is coming. The eastern sky begins to loosen from black into gray. Shapes become easier to see. That is bad. The same light that helps mechanics also helps observers. Roads become visible. Moving vehicles become targets. Smoke trails betray positions. A tank being towed at dawn is no longer a secret. It is a slow object waiting to be found. The crew must get it away. The towing vehicle pulls again. Behind them, The battlefield remains full of wrecks that will not be saved. Some are burned too deeply. Some are too far forward. Some belong to crews who will never return to them. Recovery is not resurrection. It is triage. The men know this. They do not say it. By the time the damaged T-34 reaches a collection point, the repair crews are already working on other vehicles. Engines exposed. Tracks broken open. Wheels removed. Men bent over hulls with the intensity of surgeons who know their patients may be sent back into danger before they are truly healed. The recovered tank joins them. Now the question changes. Can it be made useful before the next attack? A German gunner had stopped this tank the day before. A German report may have counted it among the enemy's losses. But the report did not include the sound of the cable, the third pull, the mud giving way, or the mechanic who looked at the hull and decided it was not finished. By dawn, the wreck was no longer on the battlefield. It was in the workshop behind it. And that workshop had its own brutal rules. The battlefield workshop. The repair point did not look like a place where machines were reborn. It looked like a place where machines came to die slowly. Damaged tanks stood in uneven rows, some with turrets turned at strange angles, some with tracks removed, some with engine decks open, some so burned that even in darkness they seemed blacker than everything around them. Men moved between them with tools, cables, lamps, parts, stretchers, orders, cigarettes, and faces that had forgotten sleep. The recovered T-34 arrived with mud packed into its wheels and scar tissue across its armor. A mechanic climbed onto the hull and opened the engine deck. Another looked at the track damage. A third checked the turret. The first minutes mattered. No one had time for a perfect inspection. The repair crew needed a category. Minor, medium, major, parts. Those words decided the machine's future. Minor damage meant urgency. Fix it quickly and return it. Medium damage meant work, but hope. Major damage meant delay, perhaps evacuation to a larger repair depot if transport existed. Parts meant the tank would not return as itself. It would be sacrificed piece by piece so others could move. The line between these categories could be thin. A broken track could be repaired if track links were available. A damaged wheel could be replaced if another tank had one to give. A cracked fuel line might be solved with improvisation. A damaged gearbox was worse. An engine problem could hold the tank for days or remove it entirely from immediate combat. A jammed turret ring might turn a weapon into dead weight unless enough time and skill could be found. Skill was never enough by itself. A mechanic could know exactly what was wrong and still have no part to fix it. He could have the part and no lifting equipment. He could have equipment and no fuel. He could have everything except daylight or everything except safety. At Kursk, the scale of damage placed terrible pressure on Soviet repair organizations. Accounts connected to post-battle repair efforts described the need to recover major components from irreparable tanks, engines, gearboxes, clutches, and other parts that could not simply be summoned by command. The details vary by unit and report, and specific numbers should be treated carefully, but the larger truth is clear. Damaged tanks became supply depots for other damaged tanks. A battlefield workshop lived on cannibalization. There was something almost merciless about it. A tank with a dead crew and a ruined hull might give up its engine. Another, burned through the fighting compartment, might still have usable road wheels. A turret too damaged to save might still hold optics, fittings, parts of the gun mechanism. Nothing was simply waste until someone who understood machines had looked at it. The repair crews worked with this logic every day. One machine lost so another could move. One wreck stripped so another crew could fight. One memory cut apart to keep the front from collapsing. The men did not have to speak dramatically about it. The work itself was hard enough. A welder's torch hissed under a tarp. Sparks jumped across armor and died in the mud. A man hammered a pin from a track link with blows that rang across the repair point. Another stood with his ear near an engine, listening as it turned over weakly, then stopped. He gestured for silence, tried again, listened harder. War made men into listeners. A good mechanic did not only see damage. He heard misalignment. He smelled overheating. He felt vibration through the soles of his boots. He knew when an engine was sick, when a clutch was slipping, when a transmission was lying to the driver. But war also made liars of machines. A tank might start beautifully and fail 3 kilometers later. A patch might hold during testing and split under battlefield pressure. A turret might rotate on level ground and jam when the hull twisted in a shell crater. Repairs done under desperate conditions could save a machine for one more day, but one more day was sometimes all the army asked. There was no purity in this work. A tank returned to service might still carry damage that would have kept it in a proper workshop for far longer. A crew might receive a vehicle that moved but did not inspire confidence. A commander might accept it anyway because the alternative was an empty place in the formation. This is where the German belief began to break down. German commanders could count Soviet wrecks after a battle. They could report tanks knocked out, burned, abandoned. But they could not always know which of those vehicles had been truly destroyed and which had entered the Soviet repair stream. They could not see the classification process. They could not see the parts stripped in the night. They could not see the welder working beside a tank that had been under fire that morning. They could not see a damaged vehicle moved from lost to reparable to ready across a span of hours or days. And even when the numbers were modest, even when only a handful returned quickly, those machines mattered because they returned at the moment commanders expected depletion. A repaired tank did not have to be new to be psychologically powerful. It only had to appear again. Imagine being a German gunner who had seen Soviet tanks stopped the previous day. Imagine believing the enemy's armored strength had been reduced. Then, through morning haze, seeing tanks again. Scarred, muddy, perhaps fewer than before, but still coming. The German conclusion had not been entirely wrong. Soviet losses were real, terrible, sometimes catastrophic. But the conclusion had been incomplete. The wrecks were not all endings. Some were waiting rooms. And when morning came, the battlefield would reveal which ones had returned. The morning shock. Morning on the Eastern Front rarely arrived gently. Came gray, then pale, then suddenly too bright. Smoke thinned. Fields reappeared. Broken ground took shape again. The wrecks that had been shadows became objects. Men could see what the night had hidden. German observers lifted binoculars. They expected proof of what had happened the day before. There were still Soviet tanks in the fields. Some burned. Some shattered. Some abandoned beyond saving. No recovery system could erase that. No mechanic, no matter how skilled, could turn a furnace back into a fighting vehicle. The losses were real. The dead were real. But not every space was as it had been. A tank that had lain disabled in one position was gone. Tracks in the mud showed where it had been dragged. A hull thought to be finished no longer sat where German gunners remembered it. Behind Soviet lines, engines were starting. Some vehicles moved with scars still visible on their armor. Some had replacement wheels from other machines. Some carried hurried repairs. Some probably should not have been back so soon. But they were. For the German side, this was not always dramatic in a single moment. It may not have felt like one great revelation. More often, it would have accumulated as frustration. Soviet armor that should have been weaker still appeared. Units thought to be battered still produced vehicles. Attacks came again. Pressure resumed. The German report had not lied exactly. It had simply failed to capture the afterlife of damaged machines. This is the turning point of the story. The Germans believed that stopping Soviet tanks meant reducing Soviet strength in a straightforward way. Knock out enough vehicles and the next attack must be weaker. Destroy enough armor and the enemy must pause. What really happened was more complicated. Soviet tank forces could be punished terribly and still restore part of their strength through repair. Not all. Not instantly. Not without pain. But enough to disturb enemy expectations. Some records from the fighting around Kursk show this tension clearly. After the heavy clashes near Prokhorovka, Soviet formations recorded large numbers of damaged vehicles. Some could not return quickly. Some required major work. Some were lost. But some minor and moderate repairs were completed in the days that followed, returning vehicles to the force at a time when every tank mattered. That is the key. Recovery did not make Soviet losses disappear. It made loss harder to interpret. To the German officer counting burned hulls, the battlefield looked like a ledger. To the Soviet repair system, it looked like a sorting yard. Dead, wounded, salvageable, donor, urgent, impossible. The difference between those views could decide whether the next morning's strength estimate was wrong. And in war, wrong estimates kill. A German commander planning against a depleted Soviet tank force might discover that the depletion was not as deep as expected. An anti-tank screen might face more vehicles than its reports had prepared it for. A local reserve might be committed too late because yesterday's wrecks had suggested the enemy would need more time. The shock was not that every wreck returned. The shock was that any of them did. The shock was that Soviet armored endurance did not depend only on factory output or new formations. It also depended on recovery under pressure, repair close to the front, and a willingness to treat damaged machines as temporary losses until proven otherwise. There is a moral danger here. It is easy to make this sound clean, clever, almost triumphant. It was not. A tank returning to battle might have lost half its crew the day before. A repair completed overnight might send new men into a hull that still smelled of smoke and blood. A machine saved by cannibalizing another carried the cost of the machine that had been stripped. Recovery made the army stronger, but it did not make war less brutal. In fact, it extended the brutality. A tank destroyed beyond repair is finished. A tank repaired returns to the line, and the men inside it must face the guns again. That was the bargain. Steel was saved. Men were asked to risk it again. Still, from the perspective of operational war, the effect mattered deeply. The Red Army learned to absorb damage not only through replacement but through regeneration. A force that can regenerate under fire is harder to kill than one that only consumes what it receives. And this is where the story widens. Because the recovered tank is not just one tank. It represents time. The hours saved by not waiting for a factory replacement. The days saved by repairing close to the front. The kilometers saved by dragging a vehicle to a forward repair point instead of sending it far to the rear. The parts saved by stripping one machine to rescue another. This is the mathematics of survival. Not elegant mathematics. Muddy mathematics. Measured in engines, track links, towing cables, broken clutches, sleep deprivation, and men who learned to work while artillery still muttered beyond the horizon. The Germans saw wrecks and believed they had read the result. But the result was still being written after dark. The mathematics of survival. A tank factory works in weeks and months. A battlefield repair crew works in hours. That difference can decide whether a formation fights tomorrow or waits for replacement. To understand the importance of tank recovery, imagine two damaged vehicles. The first is destroyed completely, burned out, ammunition exploded, hull ruined, crew gone. Nothing useful remains except perhaps a few pieces of metal, and even those may not be worth the risk of reaching it. That tank is a true loss. The second tank has been hit and immobilized. Its track is broken. A wheel is damaged. The crew has abandoned it because staying inside under fire would have been suicide. From a distance it looks defeated. Through binoculars it may look destroyed. But if recovered, it may need parts and labor, not replacement. The difference between those two machines is not academic. It is the difference between waiting for a new tank and returning an old one. Between filling a gap in a formation next week and filling it before the next attack. Between counting a loss permanently and counting it as a question. War is full of these questions. Can the engine be saved? Can the gearbox be replaced? Can the turret turn? Can the gun fire? Can the track be repaired here? Or must the tank be dragged farther back? Is this hull worth time? Do we have the parts? Do we have the men? Do we have the night? Each question carries numbers behind it, even if no one speaks them aloud. Distance is a number. A repair point 8 or 10 kilometers from the front can return vehicles faster than a depot hundreds of kilometers away. But it can also be shelled. A depot far to the rear is safer, but safety consumes time. Time consumes combat strength. Transport is a number. A tank requiring major repair may be theoretically recoverable, but if there are not enough tractors, trailers, rail capacity, fuel, or drivers, theory becomes useless. Spare parts are numbers. An army may have courage, doctrine, and orders, But if it lacks engines, clutches, gearboxes, optics, road wheels, and track links, damaged tanks become steel monuments to shortage. Labor is a number two. A repair team with 70 or 80 men can do only so much. Men must sleep even when orders pretend otherwise. Hands become numb. Eyes fail in poor light. Mistakes multiply after too many hours awake. A tired mechanic can misjudge a crack, miss a leak, tighten the wrong fitting, or fail to hear the sound that tells him an engine is about to fail. The battlefield does not forgive fatigue simply because the cause is important. This is why recovery was never a simple miracle. It was a contest between damage and organization. The Red Army could be brutally effective at pushing resources forward, but it also suffered from shortages, confusion, and overextension. Repair systems were strained by the sheer scale of fighting. At times, there were too few specialized recovery vehicles, too little welding equipment, too many damaged tanks arriving at once, too many parts needed from depots too far away. And still, the logic remained powerful. A minor repair completed near the front could return a tank far faster than replacement channels could. A medium repair, if parts existed, could restore combat strength in days. A major repair might remove the tank for longer, but even then the vehicle was not necessarily a permanent loss. A machine beyond repair could become a source of parts, turning its death into mechanical usefulness. This was not romantic. It was arithmetic under pressure. And the arithmetic changed how an army survived. For Germany, especially as the war lengthened, the problem of recovery and repair became increasingly painful. German tanks were often mechanically complex, spare parts were strained, recovery vehicles were insufficient, and the retreating nature of the war after 1943 meant damaged vehicles could be lost simply because the ground could not be held. A tank that might have been reparable in a stable front became a permanent loss if the army had to withdraw before it could be recovered. For the Soviets, advancing or holding ground allowed recovery teams to reclaim vehicles from battlefields they controlled. When they held the field, they could search it. When they pushed forward, they could collect what had been left behind. When they organized repair close enough to matter, they could turn tactical damage into temporary loss. The side that controls the ground after the fight often controls the wrecks. And the side that controls the wrecks controls part of tomorrow's strength. This is one reason visible destruction can mislead. The same battlefield can tell two different stories depending on who holds it after dark. A German gunner may knock out a tank at 1500 hours. If German forces hold the field, that tank may be finished. If Soviet forces recover the ground at night, the tank may enter repair. The shot was real. The damage was real. But the final meaning changed. The mathematics of survival lived in that gap. A few tanks returned quickly might not change an entire campaign by themselves. But repeated across days, across units, across fronts, repair and recovery altered the rhythm of armored warfare. It helped determine how long pressure could be sustained, how quickly units could recover from blows, and how accurately the enemy could judge exhaustion. And there was another number rarely placed at the center. The number of men required to save machines. Every recovered tank demanded human labor. Men exposed themselves to danger so steel could be used again. Mechanics gave their bodies to the maintenance of momentum. Drivers risked becoming targets while towing machines others had already escaped. Crews returned to patched vehicles knowing the battlefield had tested them once and might do so again. The German belief counted wrecks. The Soviet reality counted recoverable damage. But beneath both was the cost no table could fully hold. Who paid for those hours? Who stood beside the cable? Who opened the hatch? Who sent the repaired tank back to the line? The answer was not a machine. It was men. The cost of saving steel. The inside of a damaged tank is not only a technical space. It is a human one. A mechanic opening a hatch after battle might find broken instruments, spent shell casings, torn wiring, smoke stains, blood, personal items, a glove, a photograph, a ration tin crushed underfoot. He might find silence. He might find a wounded man who had not been heard. He might find evidence that the crew had escaped in a hurry. He might find that no one escaped at all. Recovery work forced men to approach what others had survived by leaving. There is a terrible intimacy in that. A tank seen from outside is armor, gun, engine, tracks. A tank seen after battle is a room where men were afraid. A room where decisions were made too quickly. A room where heat, noise, smoke, and impact collapsed into seconds. The repair crew had to look at such rooms and then decide what could still be used. This is why the story cannot be told only as clever logistics. Saving steel had a cost. The recovery crews faced obvious dangers. Shellfire, mines, snipers, darkness, burning fuel, unstable ammunition, snapping cables, shifting hulls. But they also faced the quieter damage of repeated exposure. They worked on machines that had carried men into death. They stripped parts from tanks that still held the shape of the battle. They returned vehicles to crews who knew exactly what had happened to the last men inside. The army needed them to be practical. War often demands practicality from people in situations where practicality feels almost inhuman. A mechanic could not stop at every mark on the armor and imagine the moment that made it. He could not spend half an hour staring at a burned hatch. He had to work, remove the plate, check the engine, pull the part, mark the hull, move on. But men are not machines. They remember even when they do not speak. Perhaps one man remembered the smell of a tank that burned too hot. Another remembered the sound a cable made before it snapped. Another remembered a driver who joked before going forward and came back on a stretcher. Another remembered the first time he realized that a repaired tank might return to combat before the blood inside had fully dried. There was no clean heroism in this. The men were not invincible. They were tired, frightened, impatient, sometimes angry, sometimes careless from exhaustion, sometimes quietly proud of work no one else understood. They could save a tank and lose a friend. They could repair a machine perfectly and watch it burn again the next day. That repetition could harden a person, or hollow him out. Think of a crew assigned to a repaired T-34. They climb onto the hull at dawn. They see weld marks, replacement parts, a road wheel that does not match the others, a patch where armor had been damaged. The commander touches the turret ring and asks whether it will hold. The mechanic says it will. Maybe he believes it. Maybe he only knows there is no better answer. The crew enters. The hatch closes. For the mechanic, the tank becomes a sound moving away, engine, tracks, exhaust, then distance. He may never know whether it survived the day. Another damaged vehicle is already waiting. This is where the meaning of recovery becomes morally complicated. A repaired tank can save lives if it protects infantry, supports an attack, or fills a gap in the line. Can also carry men back into lethal danger. Can extend combat. It can make a battered formation capable of one more assault, one more engagement, one more day of loss. War does not offer clean categories. The German gunner who knocked out the tank may have been trying to survive. The Soviet mechanic who repaired it may have been trying to do the same for his side. The crew who returned in it may have felt gratitude, dread, or nothing at all because feeling had become too expensive. Respecting history means allowing all of that to exist at once. The Red Army's recovery system was not a sentimental machine for saving beloved tanks. It was a harsh instrument of war. It preserved combat power. It reduced permanent loss. It helped formations endure. It made German assumptions less reliable. But every success passed through human hands. Hands that shook from cold. Hands burned by metal. Hands that tightened bolts on too little sleep. Hands that sometimes reached into places no one should have had to reach. The Germans believed wrecks were proof of destruction. What they did not see was the price paid to make some of those wrecks useful again. And for a long time, that price remained mostly hidden. Because official recognition, when it came, often arrived in the language of reports, numbers, categories, restored vehicles, repair capacity, shortages. Cold words for hot metal. Cold words for men working beside the dead. Recognition written too late. Armies learn slowly. Not because soldiers at the front fail to understand, but because institutions often require pain before they admit what the front has already proven. Tank recovery was one of those lessons. The men doing the work knew its importance early. A commander whose battalion had lost half its vehicles knew what one repaired tank meant. A driver waiting for a replacement knew. Infantrymen waiting for armored support knew. Mechanics knew before anyone else, because they saw the gap between official strength and mechanical reality. But recognition in war often travels upward through paperwork. Reports described damaged vehicles, repair categories, shortages, restored tanks, available parts, missing equipment. They noted the need for more recovery resources, more mobile repair capacity, more welding equipment, more transport, more trained personnel. They turned nights of fear and labor into administrative language. That language mattered, could change allocations, could move repair units. It could bring forward depots closer to the fighting. It could identify shortages in engines, gearboxes, clutches, and other components. It could persuade command that recovery was not secondary work, but part of combat power. Still, a report cannot fully describe a night recovery under shellfire. Cannot show the mud. Cannot show the driver easing forward without lights. It cannot show a mechanic listening to an engine and knowing from one uneven note that the repair will fail if they push too hard. Cannot show the moment a man realizes the tank he saved yesterday has returned again, damaged worse this time. But institutions need reports, and through them the lesson spread. By 1943, the scale of armored fighting forced all major armies to confront the reality that maintenance and recovery were not rear area inconveniences. They were central to mechanized war. A tank army without repair capacity was not a tank army for long. It was a temporary concentration of machines moving toward breakdown. The Soviets learned under conditions of brutal necessity. They organized repair points, used mobile depots, recovered parts, and pushed support closer to the front when possible. They still suffered shortages. They still struggled with transport. They still lost vehicles that might have been saved under better conditions. But the pressure of the war forced repair and recovery into operational thinking. German commanders, watching Soviet forces continue to apply pressure after terrible losses, had to confront a reality their battlefield counts did not fully explain. Soviet armored strength was not only produced behind the Urals or delivered by rail. It was also recreated in pieces near the front. Not perfectly, not predictably, but persistently. That persistence had strategic consequences. As the Red Army moved west, momentum became everything. Every kilometer gained stretched supply. Every river crossing demanded engineering. Every advance created new breakdowns. Tanks did not become easier to maintain because the army was winning. In some ways, victory made maintenance harder. The front moved. Roads changed. Depots had to follow. Wrecks had to be collected from new fields. But an army that had learned to repair under pressure could carry that habit forward. Recovery became part of the rhythm of advance. Fight, recover, repair, refuel, reorganize, attack again. The process was never smooth, but it allowed pressure to continue in a way that pure replacement could not. And yet the men themselves often remained blurred. A famous tank commander might be remembered. A major battle might be studied. A model of tank might become legendary. But the recovery crew that dragged a damaged vehicle out of a killing ground at night, their names were less likely to survive. This is common in war memory. The visible weapon receives the story. The invisible labor receives a footnote. But the footnote is often where the real war hides. The Germans believed that Soviet recovery was too crude, too chaotic, or too minor to alter the battlefield meaningfully. That belief made sense if one looked only at the burning hulks in daylight. What really happened was that the crude work mattered precisely because the war itself was crude. Mud, shortages, exhaustion, and damage did not require elegant answers. They required answers that worked before dawn. A tank did not need to return flawless. It needed to return in time. That was the lesson. And it arrived, as many wartime lessons do, after men had already died proving it. The wreck that wasn't finished. Returned to the field before dawn. The damaged T-34 is there again in the mind's eye, half buried in mud, its track broken, its armor cold, its turret turned toward the dark. The artillery has moved farther away for a moment. A cable lies across the ground. Men breathe quietly because even breath can feel too loud when death is listening. The hook touches steel. A small sound. Almost nothing. But in that sound is the part of war that battlefield maps rarely capture. The map shows arrows. The report shows losses. The photograph shows wrecks. The official history shows the battle's movement from one day to the next. But between those things were men working in the dark, trying to decide whether destruction had truly finished its work. They believed a Soviet tank was finished when it stopped moving. That belief was not foolish. A stopped tank in battle is a terrible sight for the crew inside it. It can become a target, a prison, a furnace, a landmark for enemy gunners. Many stopped tanks never returned. Many burned where they stood. Many carried men who did not come back. But what really happened was more complicated than the visible wreckage. Some tanks stopped because they were destroyed. Some stopped because they were wounded. And the difference was decided not by the enemy who fired the shot, but by the men who reached the tank afterward. Recovery did not erase loss. It did not make Soviet armor invincible. It did not undo the deaths inside burning hulls or the fear of crews ordered forward again. It did not turn war into engineering. It simply revealed something harsher. In industrial war, survival belonged not only to the strongest machine, but to the system that could keep damaged machines from disappearing. A tank could be a weapon in the morning, a wreck in the afternoon, a repair problem by midnight, and a weapon again days later. That cycle was exhausting, consumed men, parts, fuel, sleep, and memory. But it changed the battlefield. German commanders could look across a field and count what they believed they had killed. Soviet mechanics could look at the same field and count what might still be dragged back. Those two views collided in mud, under shellfire, after sunset. And sometimes the mechanic was right. Sometimes the cable held. Sometimes the track was replaced. Sometimes the engine turned over. Sometimes the scarred tank moved forward again. Not new, not clean, not heroic in any simple way, but real. That is the truth at the center of this story. War is remembered through explosions because explosions are loud. A tank burning in a field demands attention. A gun firing at close range becomes a memory men cannot escape. A breakthrough appears on a map and seems to explain everything. Recovery is quieter. It is the scrape of steel in mud. The cough of an engine that should be dead. The whisper of a driver told to move without lights. The hiss of a welding torch under a canvas sheet. The dull ring of a hammer against track pins while exhausted men wait for dawn. It does not look like victory, but sometimes it is what makes victory possible. They believed Soviet tank recovery was useless because wrecks looked final. What really happened was that the Red Army learned to fight for the wreck after the battle, to pull damaged steel back from the edge of destruction, and to make the enemy's certainty less certain by morning. The tank in the mud was not always a monument to defeat. Sometimes it was only waiting for the cable. Final CTA. If this story reached you, tell us where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served in the war in any uniform on any front, you are welcome to share their name or memory in the comments. War is often remembered through famous battles and famous commanders, but many of its hardest truths were carried by people whose names rarely appeared in history books. Subscribe to Warfront Archive for more forgotten stories from the Second World War, what they believed and what really happened.